Hey everyone, Sonic Senryaku here, coming at you with another Neo the Wardens with You video. Today we will be speaking yet again about another mechanic that the game doesn't explain directly to the player its implications, but instead expects you through combat experience to learn its nuances so that you can apply them intelligently in combat. The mechanic I'm referring to is an enemy hit state that the game identifies as the down state, a state that the enemy assumes when landing onto the ground after being knocked off its ass by a party member's pin attack. When an enemy enters the down state, their get up animation plays, and during these frames, they become impervious to any attack that inflicts a knockback state. This is probably because when an enemy enters the down state, they're enveloped in strong armor, which makes them resistive to attacks that inflict a knockback state, but isn't adequate enough to protect them from attacks that launch or send them flying across the field. What's more, enemy noise simply hitting the ground doesn't mean they've entered the down state. If you look carefully, you can see that all enemies capable of being lifted off the arena, when they fall, will bounce off the floor slightly before landing permanently. That initial bounce off the ground is not registered as a down state, meaning enemies can still be inflicted with the knockback hit state as a result. The only noise type whose down state behaves differently are shark noises. When a player pops a shark from out of the ground, it retains the down state strong armor for some reason, meaning that even if you were to send them flying or launch them in the air, they will still not be affected by knockback inflicting attacks. It's only when you attack them as they're getting ready to dive back into the ground that they lose their downstate armor completely and can be affected by knockback, whether in the air or fully on the ground. I imagine this has to do with the way the game codes the shark hit state while under the ground, especially since they immediately enter a downstate when knocked onto the surface. These details also seem to affect the behavior of the revenge value state compared to that of other noises. If you've ever noticed, shark noises don't flash red after being hit preceding a yellow flash. They just jump back into the ground, which is opposite of what typically happens when an enemy enters the revenge state, clearly a result of the methodology to which sharks attack. But leaving that relevant tangent aside, how is being knowledgeable about the downstate useful in combat, let alone with creating interesting combos? Well, for one, if I recognize that an enemy has assumed the downstate, I might want to reconsider activating a pin that inflicts knockback, and instead use a psych that would override the downstate to net some kind of positional advantage. Knowing that an enemy's downstate would nullify my psych's knockback might be a waste of resources depending on my combat goals, so being conscientious of that helps with choosing what might be a more auspicious offense option. What's more, understanding the significance of the ground bounce animation that plays before an enemy enters the downstate can influence the way a player might time certain combos. For example, setting up a bomb, then using the pin patchy to send an enemy flying, proceeding to dash behind the enemy with the wolf pin, before letting rip a fully charged shotgun sight to knock the enemy back into the explosion, is only possible if you either fire off the attack before the enemy touches the ground or during the ground bounce animation. More often than not, the enemy will drop to the ground during this combo sequence before you can get off a fully charged shotgun attack, so understanding that the enemy bouncing off the ground makes them susceptible to knockback is essential here. A player understanding this detail would know how to execute this sequence of attacks flawlessly, while one not privy to how the downstate works would question why there are times when the shotgun knockback affects the noise and times when it doesn't. Then there are situations where leaving the enemy in a downstate can be taken advantage of in advanced play without slowing down your offensive rhythm, such as performing set play combos. For example, if I wanted to use Swift Strike to move through an enemy to set up bombs, having them downed and unable to be affected by knockback becomes crucial in maintaining the enemy's position to your liking without unwanted disruption. Also, by the enemy inherently needing a few seconds to recover from the downstate, the allotted time spared to the player makes it ideal for positioning the necessary traps and party members required for complex set play, necessitating that extra bit of prep time. I'd like to take a quick moment to go over a combo featured in my Zeptograms Must Die video, to analyze how I use my knowledge of the downstate to engineer my plays. So right here, once the Scorpion is sucked in by the Black Hole Time Bomb, I strike twice with the Wolf Pin before the Scorpion hits the ground, so that it's susceptible to the knockback from the attack. The knockback from these Swift Strikes juggle the target back and forth. Then I unleash a Disco Dive Kick to knock the Scorpion further away, before letting rip a stuck in the middle shotgun blast to pull the Scorpion into the Shidare blades coming from behind for a nice confusion status effect. What I'm going for here is this snappy push and pull juggle sequence, all of which was possible because the Scorpion noise was still vulnerable to knockback. Once the Scorpion hits the ground fully and enters the downstate, I know I can conduct the next phase of my combo without messing up my positioning, since the Scorpion will no longer be affected by the knockback from Wolf. Also, the time required for the noise to recover from the downstate, disregarding the confusion status it is already under, means I can set up a bomb on one end, set up a disco dive kick behind the Scorpion, then come back in front of it to blast it away with an attack from Patchy. This setup here leads to the second push and pull juggling sequence, in which the Scorpion gets blasted away, sucked back into some Shadare blades for another confusion status, then gets hit from behind by a disco dive kick while being sucked into the bomb so as to be locked in place while I activate my mashup attack and close off the combo with some well-timed swift strikes. This entire combo functions the way it does through awareness of the downstate and utilizing that knowledge to properly plan each phase of the combo. So as you can see, understanding the downstate also lends itself to choosing options necessary for optimal positional follow-ups. Oh, the enemy is airborne. Do I use a lance attack to push them around in the air before sending them flying in the opposite direction with a massive hit pin? Should I catch the enemy as it's falling with swift strikes to jostle it behind me so that I can position it to go into the opposite direction? Oh man, the enemy hit the ground and assumed its downstate without that being my intention. Let me get it off the ground with a launcher or a massive hit attack to override that state, then before it falls, since I want the enemy behind me, I'll use my stuck in the middle pin to pull it backwards, as it'll only be able to inflict that knockback outside of the downstate. Can you start to see how intuitive combat decisions can start to emerge simply by recognizing this enemy refractory state? The pertinence of the downstate recognition becomes invaluable when you're trying to swiftly respond and devise alluring positional combos, as every choice you make to either allow or disavow the downstate will influence the dimensionality of your approach. Now you may be thinking that this is as involved as the downstate mechanic gets, but oh no my peoples, there's yet another layer to this rabbit hole. Up until now, we've spoken about the downstate being induced when an enemy hits the ground, as it seems like that's the only time such a hit state would even be relevant, right? However, it's actually possible to put an enemy into the downstate while airborne by using dynamite dart psychs that freeze or entune. Whenever an enemy is encapsulated by the elemental dart explosion, you can see a small animation illustrating the enemy's aerial momentum cancelling out and a sharp downwards direction takes suit. It is in this moment where the enemy has entered the downstate. You can tell because any attempts to inflict knockback hit states against the frozen foes are completely nullified. However, as expected, they can still be launched and sent flying. So why is this even worth mentioning? Once again, it's all about the modalities of combo expression that you can muster with this knowledge. Being able to induce the downstate in the air means a player has the ability to switch the aerial momentum of their combo. Maybe a player might want to launch an enemy upwards into a delayed dynamite dart explosion, inducing the downstate, so that any other pin attacks that might have initially inflicted knockback no longer do. This results in any attacks that inflicted knockback to stagger the enemy in place while in midair as opposed to drifting them across the arena. The aesthetic achieved here is this sort of aerial juggling that keeps the enemy locked in place, which can then be improvised upon by activating a launcher or a massive hit attack, subjecting the enemy once more to knockback and opening up the option to drift them around the arena. Being able to switch between suspended aerial juggles by inducing the downstate and knockback drifting once you override the downstate makes for interesting air combo variety, which of course is what you'd want in a well-tuned action game. Now, while testing to see what makes dynamite darts inflict the downstate, I noticed certain moments when enemies would instead be frozen in a state susceptible to knockback when it shouldn't be possible. No, don't worry, that isn't random. But that's a kind of mechanical nuance I'd rather save for an addendum video, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I genuinely wanted this exploration of the downstate to expand players' approach to combat and reconfigure the way with which you choose your options. Like and subscribe to stay locked in for future videos. Until next time, be seeing you.
いい感じじゃない？